Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Listen with Vobes. It's just coming up to 4 o'clock here in the UK, and we are very close to the end of London Belongs to Me. Hello and welcome along. Hello to the lovely Julia, to Tool Podge Rog, to Billabong O'Neill, to Turbo Stream from a clear blue sky and windy Pembrokeshire. Hello to you. Sensible Paul, good afternoon. David Vad, Justine Jones, Coco, Phil and Mary Hammond, hello to you in Bognor. Audrey Forbes, Jen Coley, Alison O'Brien and Lee Lawson so far are here to watch the... I don't know whether we'll get to the end, but let's see how far we are. We are on chapter 90. Chapter 90. It was... a very dramatic chapter last time, or episode. And we will continue now with the next exciting part. I've got to go at 5 p.m. prompt. Committee meeting on Zoom. Oh dear. I will do my best. James Poulton, good afternoon to you. Lovely to see you. Right, let's scamper on. Even though Mr. Puddy knew nothing about it, his old friend Mr. Josser had watched the blaze right through. From the front garden of Conservatory Cottage, he saw the whole thing. Admittedly, from 20 miles away, he couldn't really detect which was Mr. Puddy's particular part of the general flare-up and what was simply the rest of London going up in flames. So far as Ditchfield was concerned, the new fire of London was just a great red glare in the sky, with streamers of bright orange that ran up into it. It was a pretty handsome scenic spectacle too, because all the while the anti-aircraft shells were bursting, quite silently at that distance, in the midst of it, and the fingers of the searchlight waved and pointed. Because everything was so silent, there was an unreality to it. It might have been some children's party on a prodigious scale, complete with Bengal lights and penny sparklers that they were watching. But for a children's party, it was too long drawn out. The clouds over London were still salmon-coloured in places. A good half hour after dawn began lighting up things on its own account. Mrs. Josser stood out there beside him during the greater part of the time, and while they watched the sky flicker and perform, they both remembered Larkspur Road beneath it, and Baby, and Doris, and Cynthia, and wondered what was happening to them. It was a grisly business just standing there in the front row of the balcony, so to speak, watching the huge funeral pyre on which at any moment granddaughter, daughter and daughter-in-law might all be heaped. Mr. Josser was the first to speak. "I'm going up in the morning," he said. "Reckon I'll catch the early train. They oughtn't to spend another night there, not with things like this." Mrs. Josser, however, had already taken things a stage further in her own mind. "And if there's any trouble with Cynthia, just you put Baby under your arm and bring her down," she directed. "Cynthia will come as soon as she finds Baby's gone. As for Doris, just tell her I said so." You wouldn't like to come up yourself?" Mr. Josser inquired tactfully. But Mrs. Josser only held him in contempt for the suggestion. "Me?" she asked scornfully. "And what about getting the cottage ready? Someone's got to do it. If there's going to be three more of us tonight, I've got to do the rearranging." In a way, it was strange after last night even to be going to London at all. There seemed at least reasonable doubt that the place would still be there. But for the first half of the journey there was nothing to show that last night hadn't been as peaceful as any other night in September. Day had dawned on a beautiful silky morning, and the little suburban villas, with their small oblongs of garden backing onto the railway, looked snug and comfortable. There were children playing in them, and here and there a baby taking its nap in a perambulator. No matter out of which side of the carriage Mr. Josser looked, there was still nothing to show for that massed midnight spectacle of star shells and illuminations. Then, round a curve in the line, he abruptly found himself in the war zone. He was getting into London by now, and under the balloons, the little villas were packed and crowded. They were suburbs of a previous generation, and overnight they had been opened out, disemboweled. A bomb, quite a big bomb it seemed, had come down in the midst of them. 2 little villas had disappeared completely. There was simply a large, untidy crater filled with litter where they had been standing only 8 hours earlier. So little of them was left, indeed, that it was difficult to feel any sense of loss. It was the houses on either side that brought to mind the damage and destruction. There was something shocking and vaguely indecent about the way in which they were exposed. The back of one of them had been pared clean off, and a bedroom, complete with bed, was open to the railway. Another bed, upside down this time, rested in the garden, and on the end of a length of lead pipe, a bath, soiled and abraded by the rubbings of countless bathers, hung straight down over the remains of a staircase. In another little villa there was an iron gate with a mantelpiece and picture over it, but it was simply an iron grate, not a gate, an iron grate with a mantelpiece and a picture over it, but it was simply a grate set in the open air. There was no room for the iron grate to warm anything any longer. The next man to Mr. Josser leaned over. "Lucky it didn't hit the line," he remarked consolingly. Mr. Josser nodded politely. He was too shocked to do more. Shocked by the sheer flimsiness of the houses that people had been living in. Before the blast had caught them, they had looked ugly, sordid, overcrowded, anything you like, but solid. He could see that now they were really shams. The brick that they were made of was nursery bricks, and ceilings were matchwood. Against the sky, the broken rafters showed up like fish bones. The whole thing was makeshift and temporary looking. It might have been in a native kraal that the bomb had fallen. It was quite a long time afterwards when he saw the next reminder of last night. The line ran here, and he could see out of the landscape. The line ran high here, and he could see out across the landscape of the rooftops. Against the skyline stood the open-work girders of what, up until yesterday, had been a factory. Now Mr. Josser could see right through it. At one corner the tall chimney stack was still standing, even though there was no smoke coming out of it. But over the whole building there hung an opaque, dirty mist, and the fireman was still pumping in water, and the mist was constantly renewing itself. It was not until Mr. Josser reached Liverpool Street that he actually smelt burning. But it was there all right. A rank, frosty odour hung over everything, as though an incinerator door had been opened. But there was no more than a smell of burning to distract him. The streets outside the station were full of scorched paper, charred embers of what might once have been office ledgers, and large cobwebby smuts that were all that left of the filing systems and double-entry bookkeeping. Underfoot was the crunch and jingle of good plate glass. The extraordinary thing was that by the time Mr. Josser had got to the embankment, he was out of the war again. The plane trees hadn't lost a leaf, and the Thames was sliding peacefully along. There was no sign of misery and dissolution there. Either the Germans were very thorough and conscientious and were going to demolish London methodically, parish by parish, or the late summer's night hadn't been long enough for them. The look of the embankment comforted Mr. Josser, and the thought occurred to him that simply because London was such an enormous target, it was safe. The Germans could go on ravaging and tearing away at it, but at this rate they'd need a lifetime to destroy it. By the time Marshal Goering was an old man, there would still be bits that were recognisably London left standing. And it was the same all the way to Larkspur Road, except for the church roof that had gone and a few windows missing, and a whole street roped off with a hanging notice that said, "Unexploded bomb." Streatham was as calm and normal as Ditchfield had been. The chances of baby's survival seemed better. They seemed good, in fact. She might even have slept through it. Even so, when he got to Larkspur Road, it was all far simpler than Mrs. Josser had hinted that it might be. There was no need for kidnapping and scarcely any need for persuasion. Cynthia didn't have to tell him what sort of night that she'd been through. He could see. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was all anyhow. It didn't even look so blonde as usual. This was the first time Mr. Josser had ever seen her really close when she hadn't got any makeup on, and he was surprised to notice how sallow she was. How sallow and tired and unblooming. Conservatory Cottage, with its sunny half-acre, was evidently just as much the place for her as it was for baby. He blamed himself again for not having insisted that she should come down there sooner. And now that he put it to her, there was no opposition. Cynthia didn't want baby to spend another night in London. 4 or 5 separate and distinct times last night she said, with a little giggle, she expected it to be all up for the 3 of them. But it was not Mr. Josser who finally clinched it. It was Ted. His authority, calm, sagacious and unruffled, still hung over the little flat, and Cynthia invoked it. It wouldn't seem right to Ted to leave baby here with all that noise going on. It couldn't be good for her nerves, she explained. He'd be dead against it. Doris thinks he would too. So it was decided, and Mr. Josser helped Cynthia to pack. It wasn't easy because baby required a lot of things, an astonishing lot. One after another, the fibre travelling cases, there wasn't a decent-sized trunk in the whole flat, were filled with dresses, underclothes, nightgowns, toys. But that was only the beginning. Cynthia couldn't reasonably be expected to start a new life in a cottage without anything to wear for herself. And the pile of dresses on the bed grew steadily larger, and while all the time Cynthia kept adding little things that she couldn't possibly do without. The case of silver spoons that had been a wedding present, her toilet set, Ted's photograph, the library book she was reading, a packet of jellies for baby's supper, a box of special shampoo sachets. While she was going through her shoes to see which pairs were worth taking, Mr. Josser slipped out for a moment to phone Doris. He had more than half expected her to be at Larkspur Road, and it was awkward that she had gone along to the office just as though nothing had happened. But people are usually far more independent and obstinate over the phone than they are face to face. It took Mr. Josser some time to get through. The telephones were evidently in still a bit of a tangle from the raid, and the operator doubted whether it was worth trying. But when at last Doris answered, it was easier than it had been with Cynthia. "My, you've been quick," she said. "Quick?" Mr. Josser asked her. "I just wanted to make sure you're all right." "Oh, then you didn't get my wire?" Mr. Josser paused. It hadn't come when I left, he told her. Perhaps Mother's got it. Oh, because I asked if she could have Cynthia and the baby, Doris went on. Well, that's what I'm here about, Mr. Josser explained. Cynthia's packing. I've just been there. Oh, you are a darling, Doris said. It was Mother's idea, Mr. Josser replied firmly, and she says you're to come down too. She told me to tell you. There was another pause, a longer pause this time. Oh, all right, Doris answered. Say I'll be down later. The voice in which she answered was flat and weary-sounding, with all the overtones rubbed out. She hadn't meant to say she'd go. It was such a journey. But now she came to think about it, she was supposed she was rather sleepy, and if the Germans came over again at sundown, it wouldn't be good for anything in the morning. She wouldn't be any good for anything in the morning. In the circumstances, it was only common sense to take a chance of a good night's rest when she could find it. Besides, if she stayed on at the flat, Bill might start worrying, and that was the last thing he wanted, or the last thing she wanted. By the time Mr. Josser got back to the flat, he found Cynthia had thought of quite a lot of other things that she needed. The cupboards had practically been emptied in his absence, and the contents added to the pile. What was more, there was no spare suitcases. Mr. Josser took off his coat and got down to it. It was evident that this was going to be a string and brown paper evacuation after all. I don't know about you, but it's bloody cold in here today. Hello to Andrew Norris, to Michael White, to Dudley Sawyer and Tracy Strickland Mottram. Lovely to have you with us. We're on chapter 91. It was different for Connie. She had to stick the raid out too, her old teeth chattering. And if the Germans came over tonight, or any other night for that matter, she'd have to stick it out just the same. She hadn't got a sugar daddy to come and take her into the country away from the nasty noises. She hadn't got anyone. And it was because of this, or rather because of this on top of everything else, that she was crying. Crying because there wasn't anyone in the whole world who cared enough about her even to send a postcard. But it wasn't only the loneliness that was the trouble. If she had been surrounded by loving friends, she still would have felt awful. And not just ordinary awful either. This was something special, something chronic, something that the doctors had never been taught about. And it was because there wasn't any cure for it, bar one, that she was crying. Her face was all puffy and smudgy from the tears, and the eye black had run right down her cheeks into two dark tunnels. She'd been like that for hours, just sitting there, sobbing and trying not to think about it. But what was the use of trying not to think about it when you didn't know what it was? There wasn't anything specific or particular about the pain, nothing that you could actually put your finger on and say, oh. It wasn't in any one place, simply a all-over sickness. Something was in the bones and in the blood, something that was eating the lungs and binding the heart, something that didn't make her food taste so good any longer, and buzzed and bubbled inside her head whenever she lay down, something that drew her cheeks in so that there were pockets where the dimples had once been, and made her poor old legs swell so that she couldn't get her shoes on. She shook her head sadly. It's me notice, she told herself. It's me calling up papers. It's me cue. Better get ready, Connie. And with this premonition, she grew calmer. Tears and all, she was steadier now. Kind of peaceful inside herself, as it were. She looked back over the past life almost as though it were somebody else's. And crikey, it wasn't half a waste. The money that she had in her time, the chances, talk about chucking opportunities away, she fairly shoveled them. Offers of marriage, little places at Maidenhead, sovereigns slipped in playfully under the frilly part of her garter. Diamonds. If she'd watched her step, she could have been a rich woman by now, rolling in it, paying super tax. And instead of it, What was she? She was just an old girl with the dyed hair who sat behind the counter in the ladies' cloakroom and had a saucer with a few pins in it in front of her, ready to receive the tips. It wasn't even as if she'd learned any sense as she'd grown older. Not a bit of it. Her 60-odd pounds from the accident had gone all the way in cash. There wasn't a penny left of it, all out of anything else. She was really high and dry this time, washed up and flapping. She could feel her tired gills closing. She'd been too ill last night to get along to the club at all. They had to go through the raid without her, and because she hadn't been along, well, she was afraid to face them now, afraid of what they might say, afraid of what she might find when she got there. How did she know there wasn't someone new, more glossy, pussycat-like, sitting there on the cushions already? And why hadn't she phoned up and said that she wasn't well? Because, silly, you can't phone up when you haven't got as much as twopence in your handbag and you don't like to borrow from your landlady because you owe 2 weeks' rent already and would rather she put it down to sheer forgetfulness. Connie suddenly screwed up her face so that the wrinkles all ran into one. The pain had come back again. In her side and working up towards the middle. The pain had come back a bit in her side and working all the way up to the middle. In a minute it would start giving her little jabs right under the heart, the way it always did. She couldn't rely on even 5 minutes' peace and comfort nowadays. "I wish I was dead," she began again. "Dead and underground, tucked away somewhere, quiet, where the pain couldn't get at me, laid out proper and put to rest, helping up next year's roses." Then she sat bolt upright. "Well, why shouldn't I?" she asked herself. "Who's to stop me? It's my sacred spark, isn't it? Nobody else's." She'd done it. Just like that, with no warning. 5 minutes before, the idea hadn't even occurred to her. And now she'd booked her passage. Booked the one passage which is a single fare only and no return. She'd taken 10 aspirins and 3 sleeping tablets. And when her eye caught the bit about the being dangerous if to exceed the stated dose, she just couldn't help herself from laughing. She was half unconscious already. Just lying there, doll-sized, scarcely breathing. One yellow arm hung down out of the bed, trailing, and the other was folded across her chest with the knuckles up against her eyes as if she'd been crying. As suicides went, it had been nothing. Simply swallowing the tablets was easy. She'd gulped them down with some water out of a tooth glass, and she'd taken another 40 if necessary. She'd have taken another 40 if necessary. For as long as she could think clearly, with all that drug inside her, she argued it out, and the answer still came the same. She was within her rights. There had been no other way out for it. It wasn't Connie who was walking out on her part. The whole cast had walked out on her, and she wasn't standing for it. Then, just as her eyes were misting over and closing, a bright light came to her. She saw how selfish and sinful she'd been, and she wanted to be alive again, wanted it desperately. She tried to sit up for a moment in bed. Sit up? She couldn't even draw her arm in. It was too late now for any misgivings. She was numb all over. Already it was someone else's feet that were at the bottom of her legs. She said goodbye for the last time. And that was why, longing for something that she couldn't have been... Oh, for goodness sake, Vobes, come on, read it properly. That was why, longing for something that she couldn't have because she'd given it away herself, she was crying when she finally passed out. The bright lights that had come to her wasn't an inner one, It was simply the afternoon sunlight catching the brass edge of the birdcage. But it had been enough. She realised in a moment that she wasn't quite alone. There was someone dependent on her, and that was every bit as good as having someone to turn to. Because of Duke, she'd wanted to go on living. Anyway, it was all over now. She was in heaven. And the realisation astonished her that even after the awful thing she'd done, it was heaven and not the other place. Either the regulations were more merciful than anyone had led her to suppose, or somebody had blundered. Whichever way it was, she wasn't going to say anything unless they raised the matter with her. She didn't know how long she'd been there, because time didn't seem to matter very much. All that she knew was that the pain had stopped and she felt better. Felt better and liked the new neighbourhood. It was a bit strange, of course, little cherubs sitting about on V1 spring clouds and choirs of angels conducted by a seraphim like Jack Buchan making music in the corners, but not so strange that she couldn't get used to it. And everyone was so friendly too. "How are you, Connie? Better? Are you settled in all right? Is there anything you want? Remember, you only have to ask." She was having that sort of remark made to her all the time. What was more, she seemed to know all about the introduction. "I'm fine, thank you, Luke," she said, before she realised that she'd never really met the saint before. Funny thing was her age. As soon as she got there, she naturally gone to tidy herself up in the ladies by the front entrance, and when she looked in the big mirror that was hanging up there, she scarcely knew herself. She wasn't exactly young again, not 17 or anything like that, but she certainly didn't look her age. She was so much fatter, and her hair didn't seem to have been dyed. With wartime lighting, she might have passed for 35. Anywhere. She wasn't even surprised, though she couldn't help going a bit trembly when she heard that St. Peter was coming to see her that afternoon. Not Connie going to see St. Peter, but St. Peter coming to see Connie. A sort of royal visit, as it were. But it didn't turn out a bit that way. There wasn't any guard of honour or curtsying or trumpets or any of that sort of thing. In fact, she didn't properly realise that he had come until she'd found him sitting there beside her, leaning up against the same star. And he wasn't at least as she had imagined. There was no long robe or white beard, no saint's clown, no sword, no key. He was simply a middle-aged man in a dark suit and a bow tie with a rolled-up umbrella hanging over his forearm. Altogether, he was just like the nice, kind gentleman at the railway station who'd give her a £1 note to buy Mars bars for the evacuees. He was so much like him, in fact, that she became quite alarmed for a moment. She wondered if they could really be one and the same person. It didn't put her at ease when St. Peter hung up his black Homburg onto one of the points of stars and began opening the black briefcase that he'd got with him. "Just 1 or 2 points I'd like to run over with you," he said. "I always like to meet the new arrivals personally." Connie couldn't help noticing that the file he'd taken out of the briefcase had her name on in full, with Connie in brackets afterwards. He'd even had her old addresses, one after the other, right back to childhood days. Below the last one, 10 Dulcimer Street, SE2, a double line had been drawn in red ink with the words "Final Departure" and date, 7th of September 1940, with a rubber stamp afterwards. Well, it was her dossier, all right. Would you like anything to say first, or shall I begin right away?" St. Peter asked her. As he spoke, he opened up the folder with all the pages neatly fastened in loose-leaf fashion, and some of the sheets flagged with red adhesive tape. Should have liked to know what those sheets said, but the way St. Peter was holding the folder, it was impossible. It would have looked bad if he'd caught her eye trying to cheat. Besides, what was the use of it? It wasn't like being up before the beak. You couldn't fool St. Peter, or at least she supposed you couldn't. There was only one thing for it, and that was to make a clean breast of everything. "There's just one little thing I'd like to say," she told him quietly. "I do appreciate being here. It's very kind of you to take the trouble." "No trouble at all, Connie, I assure you," he told her. "We'd been expecting you." Looking back on it, she wondered why she hadn't let it go at that. But there was something about him that was so frank and friendly that she suddenly found herself wanting to tell him things, all sorts of things. If only she could get those off her chest, she'd feel better. But when she actually came to it, she realised that she didn't know him well enough. So all she did was to mutter something general by way of an apology. "I've led a rotten sort of life," was what she said. "Oh, really?" St. Peter asked in a surprised sort of voice. "It doesn't say anything about that here." "Not say anything?" She whistled. It looked as though someone had been keeping the facts from him. I haven't always been good," she said lamely. "In what way?" St. Peter asked, flipping through the dossier with his finger. That was rather embarrassing. She would much rather that he had blamed her for it than and be done with it. This business of making her tell him was slower than she'd liked. She'd rather have one walloping neck-break speed confession that would have left her gasping. "Oh, almost in every way," she said, with a little gesture of hopelessness. "I've knocked around quite a bit one way or another. I was only a kid the first time I fell." "How much of a kid?" he asked. "Under 16, she answered, dropping her eyes. St. Peter paused. "Under 16, he repeated. "That's a long while ago, isn't it?" Connie nodded. "Of course," St. Peter went on, if you'd come to us then, we'd have spoken to you about it. We could have overlooked it, but you're practically a different person now, so there's no point in going back at it like that." Connie looked up. "You mean it?" she asked. "Certainly," St. Peter told her. "It would only make you unhappy." "And does that go for all the rest of them?" Connie inquired politely. All my gay days, I mean." St. Peter didn't answer immediately. He was reading. Then he turned to her. "Not altogether," he said. There was a pause. You let one man down pretty badly," he went on. "Remember?" Connie shook her head. What was his name?" she asked faintly. "Harry." Then it all came back to her. Came back so clearly that she wanted to cry. She could remember everything about him, even the way his check suit hadn't fitted properly. And wasn't it funny? Right up to this moment, she'd always congratulated herself on not having lost her head and gone through with it. "You lost marks there," St. Peter told her. Connie kept her head averted. How many?" she asked at last. 10, St. Peter answered, "all in one go." "Out of 100? "Out of 100. "Phew." Connie wiped her forehead with a little wisp of fleecy cloud that was floating past. "Was it as bad as all that?" "Naturally," St. Peter told her. He was more serious now, still friendly, but definitely serious. "If you'd married him, you would have had children. We've got them already, and they weren't wanted." "My children?" Connie asked him. St. Peter nodded. "What were they?" 2 boys and a girl." There was a pause. "Was the girl like me?" "Spitting image," St. Peter answered. "Bit darker, perhaps, but no mistaking." She gave a little sniff. "What became of them?" she asked. "Had to go elsewhere," St. Peter explained. "We held them back as long as we could, but God wasn't able to reserve them for any longer." "The girl too?" "The girl too." She had a good cry then. A real good cry, thinking about what she'd missed. She put her head on St. Peter's shoulder and cried her heart out. When she'd finished, St. Peter lent her his own handkerchief because the fleecy cloud had moved on too far from her to catch it. "You see now what I mean," he said. Connie dropped her eyes again. "I see," she said huskily, and she did. "Well," said St. Peter, "I didn't want to upset you. We won't say any more about it. There's just one little formality and then we're through. Have you got a pen on you?" Connie shook her head. "Well, use mine," St. Peter told her. "It works all right if you shake it." It was a beautiful pen, all rolled gold and chasings. The feel of it made her better immediately again. "Now, I just want you to read this," St. Peter went on, "and initial it if it's all right. It's not too late to alter it if there are any particulars that aren't quite right." With that, he detached the last page of the dossier and handed it to her. Connie ran her eyes down it. There was a long pause. The tears were streaming down her cheeks again, and she could hardly see. "Yeah, that's me all right," she said at last. Then just initial it," St. Peter said, "in the little square at the end." Connie scribbled C.T. and reached for St. Peter's handkerchief again. But she wasn't quite through yet. "And the date," St. Peter told her. Then he got up and he put his hand on her shoulder. "Now, you're really one of us," he said. "If you want anything, you've got my number, Rainbow 1212, and of course, in an emergency, just dial 0. He held out his hand as he said it to her, and Connie took it limply. So limply that St. Peter immediately spotted that there was something wrong. "Now cheer up, Connie," he said. "Don't take it too much to heart, old girl. We get all sorts up here. Free will's a tricky business." It was 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 7th of September when Connie passed out. It was not until nearly 8 o'clock on the following morning when she came round again. The effect of the aspirins had entirely cleared off by then, and except that she was a bit light-headed for want of food, she felt marvellous. Not a pain in her, not even a headache, not even just a few head noises. Altogether she was in a better condition than she had been for years. Better and brighter and more bounce in her. Quite the old high-stepper, in fact. She got up and went over to the window. The dusk outside startled her. "You're late, Connie dear," she told herself. "Time you were getting dressed." It's Scotland Yard again, but not the room we were in before. Not Percy's room. This is 2 floors higher, and there's no football group on the wall. Simply rows and rows of filing cabinets all round the place, all lettered and all locked. In the centre of the room there is a large deal table, and round the table 3 men are sitting. They're leaning forward, and propped up against the inkwell under the low electric light is a row of photographs, all of plain, rather plump young men, all in their early 20s and all wearing glasses. Alongside them is another photograph, the master copy. One by one they keep glancing at it for comparison. "Isn't doing too badly," one of the groups was saying after a pause. "Not for a foreigner. He's a progress chaser now. Must have brains." The man on the right glances up. Even though it's Scotland Yard, he isn't a policeman. He's a lieutenant colonel. "Where would you say he is?" he asks. "Drayton and Sons, Leeds," the inspector tells him. "Optical manufacturers?" The inspector nods. "Bomb sites?" The inspector nods again. There was a pause. "When's it to be?" It is the Lieutenant Colonel who has spoken. When's what to be? The inspector asks. Bringing him in. The Lieutenant Colonel has only recently been put on special duties, but is enjoying them, and just to show how much at home he is in Scotland Yard, he likes using language of the place. But the inspector looks shocked. Oh, not yet, sir, he says. We don't want to rush things. Find out first who he's working to. Give him a run. There's no hurry. Not now he's been taken care of. The Lieutenant Colonel is a little hurt. You're quite sure this is Otto Haffel? He asks, pointing at one of the photographs. No doubt about it. Oh, no, sir, the inspector assures. Just look at the nostrils and the lobes. You'll notice that too. The inspector begins to get a bit technical. So they're going to bring him in, the little spy. Chapter 92. Down at the cottage, it was a bit of a crush, admittedly. Cynthia and Baby had Doris's room, and Doris herself had to sleep on the couch in the living room. In fact, by the time Conservatory Cottage was tucked in for the night, it was the sort of household that a billeting officer writes off as useless. Mr. and Mrs. Josser still had their own room. First, they'd wanted to give it to Doris, and Mrs. Josser had affirmed mysteriously that they could manage perfectly. She spoke rather as though that she and Mr. Josser often slept on couches and easy chairs for preference, but Doris naturally wouldn't hear of taking their bedroom. After all, it was only going to be 1 or 2 nights at the outside, and then she would be going back to her flat again. All that had been nearly a month ago, however, and there she was, still catching the 8:05 from Ditchfield Station in the morning and getting back at night time in time to have some supper, hear the news, and go to bed. It wasn't much of a life, really. There was too many hours in it spent hanging about on platforms or sitting and sometimes standing in trains. Every time she got her things together, Marshal Goering had done something else to stop her. There was no two ways about it. At the moment, London simply wasn't the right place for a good night's sleep. Mrs. Josser, in consequence, was delighted. Ever since Doris had first left home, Mrs. Josser had been devising means of recovering her. And now, with the colossal accident of war to assist her, she had achieved it. But of course, there was Cynthia to spoil everything. But even Cynthia's presence in the cottage hadn't justified Mrs. Josser's earlier forebodings. Granted, she didn't like the girl, and never would. Cynthia's pair of cherry-coloured slacks was alone enough to make Mrs. Josser wonder whatever people would think that Conservatory Cottage was coming to. But Cynthia did at least have the good sense not to interfere in the housekeeping. She laid tables, she washed up, she made her own bed, she made babies. But that was about as far as her contribution went. After that, it was simply and unostentatiously petered out. And every afternoon, and very often in the mornings as well for that matter, she would go quietly off to her room and sit there polishing her nails, brushing her hair to bring the lustre back into it, and reading Film Weekly. Everything considered, she had settled down into the way of country life quite remarkably well. All the same, if it weren't for Baby, exclaimed Cynthia frequently, she would have gone off and got herself a war job, something where she'd be doing something. But this morning it wasn't Cynthia whom they were discussing, it was Mr. Josser. He sat there at the head of the breakfast table, his bacon and fried bread uneaten on a plate in front of him, and propped up against the teapot was a letter that the postman had just delivered. Mr. Josser was engaged at the moment in rereading it. rereading it minutely and seriously so as not to miss nothing. In consequence, there was a respectful hush over the whole room. Nobody had said anything since Mrs. Josser's last remark, and that had been distinctly cold and uncompromising. "The idea of it! At your age!" was what she had said. Mr. Josser, however, had not been put off by that. He was far too much excited, so excited, indeed, that he didn't mind what anyone said about anything, and because Battlebury and Son had invited him to go back, and all because Battlebury and Son had invited him to go back to their counting house. "Dear Mr. Josser, on account of the call-up, we find ourselves short-staffed on the bookkeeping side," the letter ran, "and Mr. Battlebury wonders if you would like to rejoin the firm on your old salary. In the event of you accepting this offer, it is, of course, understood that your pension would lapse during your new service with the company. Awaiting a reply at your earliest convenience, yours sincerely, E. A. Veriter." Mr. Josser looked up. "Just as I said," he remarked. "They want me back." "Let me see the letter," Mrs. Josser demanded, tightening her lips ominously. "Half a minute," Mr. Josser answered. "I haven't finished with it yet." It irritated Mrs. Josser to be kept waiting. What's more, it was an alarming indication of the state of Mr. Josser's mind. In the ordinary way, he passed things ever so obediently as soon as he was told to. But today he was holding out on her, and she didn't like the letter any more when she got it. As soon as she'd finished reading it, she drew in her lips more tightly than before, and she kept them drawn in for some moments before speaking. "Well?" she asked. "Isn't it nice of them?" Mr. Josser replied, beaming. "Fancy them remembering me." "And why shouldn't they?" Mr. Josser looked down at his plate again. "Well," he said, "there are a lot of other fellas they may have thought of." "Not in wartime there aren't," Mrs. Josser told him. She drew her breath between her teeth. It made a sharp, hissing sound, as though a serpent had spoken. She was determined to say nothing more in front of Cynthia, and only wondered if Mr. Josser's idiotic allegiance to his old firm would make it impossible for her to keep on her decision. Apparently, the mere words "Battleby and Son" at the top of a piece of notepaper was enough to unhinge her husband. If it had actually been the majestic Mr. Battleby himself, and not simply one of his underlings who had signed the letter, Mr. Josser would probably have swooned clean away holding it. "Some life in the old chap yet, then," Mr. Josser said suddenly. "I'll show them." You'll do nothing of the sort," Mrs. Josser contradicted him. "Not with your chest." "What's my chest got to do with it?" "Do you imagine I'll let you go back there just because Mr. Battleby of yours snaps his fingers at you?" Mrs. Josser retorted. "But I'm better now. I'm perfectly well again." "And you're going to stay well? Back to work again at your age, indeed." Mrs. Josser's references to his age annoyed him. "Mr. Veriter's my age," he answered. "He's working. Mr. Veriter hasn't got your chest," Mrs. Josser reminded him. Then Mr. Josser lost his temper. Carried away by the sheer magic of the notepaper, he thumped the breakfast table. "My chest is perfectly all right," he said loudly. "It's as good as anybody else's." "Then why are we all down here instead of Dulcimer Street where we ought to be?" demanded Mrs. Josser. "Don't forget I'm the one who has all the trouble when everything goes wrong with it, not you." "But nothing's going to go wrong with it," Mr. Josser persisted. "Not if you stay here and take things quietly, it isn't," Mrs. Josser reminded him, her voice rising too. "I don't want 2 funerals on my hands inside 6 months. Her lips were drawn in tight again by now, and behind her spectacles her eyes looked misty. And it was obviously impossible to make any impression on her for the time being, and as Mr. Josser was always very much ashamed after he'd lost his temper, he decided to leave it at that. He got up at the table and went out into the garden. Usually a good smoke smoothed him, but this morning he was too unsettled to smoke. He simply stood there in the sunlight, his pipe in his hand, fiddling. The letter had brought the past back to him so closely that he wondered suddenly how he could have ever borne to be separated from it. It was as though merely by dictating the letter, Mr. Veriter had invited Mr. Josser to step back into his own youth. All because of this wonderful war, being 65 didn't matter anymore. I wonder about the trains, he was thinking. There must be some very good early ones. Back indoors, Cynthia was trying to gloss over the little incident. It's really me who ought to be getting a war job, she said, with a little giggle. Something where I'll be doing something. But Mrs. Josser was still too preoccupied to answer. She was planning to reply to Mr. Veriter's letter herself, and in the reply, Mr. Veriter was going to be given a straight piece of a wife's mind. We are on chapter 93, and we have 12.5 pages to go, which we will read tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, it being Friday, and we will finish this delightful book on Friday. How about that? Whew. There you are, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. It will be lovely to finish it at the end of the week, and that will be our chance to have a break. Regretfully, I know, but a break in the readings for a while. Give me a break as well, because I've been doing this for over a year. Day in, day out, day in, day out. It's been quite amazing, and I've loved it and enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to coming back and reading another book, but a break will be good. So that's it. Yes, there we go. Lee Lawson can go off and do her thing. We've got 12 pages, which we will read tomorrow and have a little party, an end of book party. So please bring your party hats, a nice mug of tea and some tea cake would be lovely. So there we go. I will catch up with you tomorrow and we'll finish the book and say arrivederci for now. Anyway, in the meantime, I must go and light the Essie. I've got an edit to finish, a phone call to take, and an evening to enjoy. So that's me. Look after yourselves, have a good afternoon, and ta-ta for now. Ta-ta.